Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Dr. Yosie Levine, who is the Rabbi of the Jewish Center in New York City, and is also the author of the newly published book, Chacham, Tzvi, Ashkenazi, and the Battlegrounds of the Early Modern Rabbinate, published by the Levine Library of Jewish Civilization, so a biography of the Chacham Tzvi, a long overdue biography of the Chacham Tzvi. So thank you, Rabbi Levine, for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I also want to say that some listeners maybe say, hold on, you did this already. You had him on to talk about Chacham Tzvi. And that's true. In the heyday, the early days of the podcast, way back when in 2020, we did this. We had this conversation. That was when I think you had just completed your dissertation at the time. You sent it to me. I kind of skimmed it. We did the podcast. I think it was pretty good. I re-listened to some of it. And, if I may say so, I think it was pretty good. And so, but now you came out with a full book, really went through, and I wasn't sure. There are a lot of things, as listeners will hear in this podcast, that we did not get to. And the book is, I'll say right up front, I'll give you a compliment that this is a fantastic book. I highly recommend the book to the listeners, and they'll see why. So at that point, I thought, I was back and forth. What should we do? I did an episode already a couple of years ago. It's funny, there are some podcasts that release like throwbacks. They like re-release the episode. It didn't really feel right. And just to record like a little part and to include it didn't make sense. And I do want to thank over here my good friend Yidel Glock. And this podcast is being sponsored by Glock Plumbing. I do want to say, I'll say for him, for all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer lines, snakeouts, camera and main lines, so simple faucet leak. Glock Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And as many listeners of the podcast know, Glock Plumbing has sponsored many episodes on this podcast. So he read the book and he said, this is a fantastic book. Do the podcast again and he'll sponsor the episode. And so it is sponsored by him. I want to thank him and thank Glock Plumbing. And so I said, you know what? Well, we're going to do it again. We had this conversation and we said, you know what? We're going to do it again. We're going to start from scratch and hopefully there'll be a lot more interesting information. If you want, listeners, you can go back and listen to the original one as well. But here's this. And all right, let's start off. So we're just going to jump in. We'll talk about the Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi, Tzvi Ashkenazi. Chacham Tzvi, as we'll get to, is Tzvi ben Yaakov. That's where Yaakov Emden, his son, Yavitz, is Yaakov ben Tzvi. He's born in the 17th century, dies in the early 18th century, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Yosie. I'll let you talk about this. So take it away. Tell the listeners about the Chacham Tzvi and his biography and his background. Start there.
Sure. So Chacham Tzvi, Tzvi Ashkenazi, was born in 1658 to a prominent rabbinic family in Moravia. Came of age in Budapest, and there's a lot going on during his childhood. 1665, as you know, Shabtai Tzvi appears on the scene, apostatizes a year later, and there's a messianic frenzy. If you haven't already listened to the many episodes on Shabtai Tzvi on this podcast series, I highly recommend that you do so. So this is all in the background, and of course we're happy to return to the story of Shabtai Tzvi because Sabbatianism is going to figure prominently in the adulthood and the rabbinic career of Chacham Tzvi. He trained in Sephardic yeshivos in Salonika and Constantinople, even though he was of Ashkenazic lineage. And in 1886, he's back in Budapest, present-day Budapest, Alt-Offen as it was known at the time. And it was a regrettable time to be in Budapest. There's a siege. There's a war going on between the Ottomans and the Holy League, and the Jewish community there is decimated. Tragedy strikes Chacham Tzvi very personally. His young wife and infant daughter are killed in a bomb. Chacham Tzvi manages to escape. He doesn't know the fate of his parents. Turns out that his parents are taken captive. Hostages are on our minds these days. They should all come home quickly. Later on, Chacham Tzvi learns that they were ransomed, and he's able to reunite with them. In the interim, he serves actually in a Sephardic community in Sarajevo for a couple of years, and then he makes his way back to Berlin, to his family, and he remarries. He remarries the daughter of the chief rabbi of Altona Hamburg Wandsbek. The chief rabbi of Altona Hamburg Wandsbek is a man called Zalman Newmark Mirals, There's a bunch of different names, and he settles in Altona. There's a lot to say about that triple community. Fascinating place and a very prominent Rabbanus. Chacham Tzvi doesn't have an official role. For many years, he's in charge of a klois. A klois is a privately funded study house, kind of the forerunner of a kollel, meaning it's not sponsored by the community, sponsored by a patron. And he's sitting and he's learning and he's teaching and maybe has a little business on the side. When his father-in-law passed away in 1706, it's already after many years in the klois, there's a desire among many parts of the community to make Chacham Tzvi the rabbi of Alten, Hamburg, Wandsbek. There's a little bit of a debate, and what ends up happening is he becomes the rabbi of Hamburg and Wandsbek, and Altena he alternates a little with another rabbi he doesn't always get along so well with, by the name of Rothenburg. Maram Ziskin, that's published Shilos and Chuvos, which is available. They alternate, which again wasn't such an uncommon phenomenon at the time. This goes on for a couple years, and at some point, Chacham Tzvi says, "I'm not working with this guy for reasons we could get into," and he goes back to his klois. A short time later, he receives an offer to become the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Amsterdam. Now, of all the places that you could live in 1710 in the Jewish world, there are few places that would be more desirable to be than Amsterdam for, again, reasons we could talk more about, but it's a city of affluence and religious toleration, and the Jews are doing well. The Sephardim have been there longer. They're doing really well, but even the Ashkenazim who came in the aftermath of the Chmelnytsky massacres have built up a community, and it's a prestigious Rabbanus. Chacham Tzvi becomes the chief rabbi in 1712 in Amsterdam, which is a center of print. He publishes his Shilos and Chuvos, and he continues in his Rabbanus there until 1714. Tangles with Sabadian by the name of Nehemiah Chayun, and he's basically forced out of town. He's not able to retain that rabbinate. He leaves. He spends some time in London, and then he relocates to Poland. He doesn't hold an official position for the next few years, and then finally, at the very end of his life in 1718, which is the same year that he died, he becomes chief rabbi of Lvov, Lemberg, and he dies in 1718. So, in the course of his life, he publishes two books. One in Hamburg in 1692. Not a particularly popular book. It's a commentary to the Taz's Perush on Choshen Mishpat, Hagos to the Taz on Choshen Mishpat, available on HebrewBooks.org. Even though it's hard to find because it's just doesn't even have a title. It's called something like Hagos, and then 1712 the Shilos and Chuvos. After he passes away, his children, grandchildren, others collect other Shilos and Chuvos that were not published within the lifetime of Chacham Tzvi, and that now exists in lots of editions, where you can find another 100-some-odd Chuvos that were collected after Chacham Tzvi's passing.
So there's a lot to unpack in your very brief overview, but just let's start at the end. You mentioned the Hagoyis. He actually wrote those anonymously, I believe, right?
Yeah. He writes. He publishes them basically anonymously, and he writes on the very last page, like, I really didn't want to include my name, but some people persuaded me that I should include my name to honor my parents, something like that. So I'm just letting you know my name.
All right. So there's that, and you said the Chuvas, there's additional material. Does he write anything else that we know of? So
it's a great question. Here and there, we have some drushos, Perush on a Tosfos. Sometimes he writes Haskamos. We do have 12 or 15 Haskamos that he writes, mostly when he's the chief rabbi of Amsterdam. And we could talk more about this, but, you have an opportunity to publish, so you publish. So sometimes he has a Haskama. He's like, and as long as I'm writing, let me just tell you this amazing pshat I had in Sugya, in Yerushalmi, in Eruvin. So, po v'sham, sometimes you have pieces that he published. There's broadsides. If he was in a polemic, he was in a controversy, and then almost surely there are things that he wrote that have been lost,
unfortunately. So, okay, we will, and there's also his son, Rabbi Emden, that quotes him at times as well. So we'll get to that. Okay, let's go back at least to the beginning of the biography. There's a lot to talk about here, and a lot of your book is focused on Tshuvas Chacham Tzvi, which we're going to get into, a lot of the meat of the Tshuvas and things, and his style and things like that. And we'll also get more into Chayon and the Chayon controversy, of course. As you said, this was discussed previously on the podcast, but we'll go there. So, let's talk about, you talk about when he was born and his youth and his upbringing, but a couple of things to talk about. First of all, he was from an illustrious family. His grandfather, the Shar Ephraim, from Vilna originally, he studied by him. He was in Budapest or Buda and Pest, two cities then. And so he also, he's a descendant. This is famous. We'll get to this later, of Elio Baal Shem, and this comes from the Goyim. He made the Goyim, right? Not the Maral. The Maral didn't make a Goyim, but maybe. And but his grandfather, he did, is the famous Tshuva. We're going to get to that Tshuva. So he comes from an illustrious family. You mentioned that he goes and he learns in Sephardic lands. He goes to Salonika. He's in Sarajevo as well. The interesting thing is that and that's also where he gets Chacham, presumably. It's called Ashkenazi because he learns in Sephardic lands. How unique is that? And did that also have to do with something with him growing up in Hungary? And maybe you want to talk about Hungary and Budapest at the time and the kind of Jewish culture that was going on there then.
Yeah, so all very important points. So just thinking about this moment in Jewish history, zooming out to 30,000 feet, think about what happened to centers of Jewish learning in Ashkenaz in the 17th century. It wasn't a good century for Ashkenazic Jews. So many of the centers, including Vilna, which you just mentioned, were victims of the 30 Years' War and the Chmielnitsky uprising, and Ashkenazic Jews were fleeing and were being taken captive, and it's just a terrible time. The Sephardim, relatively speaking, are doing much better. So it wasn't terribly uncommon for a young student born in Ashkenaz in the 17th century to be sent by a family to study in a Sephardic yeshiva. Until 1686, right, the predominant force in Hungary is the Ottoman Empire, and that's the milieu. So none of that is particularly surprising. I didn't see in my research anyone who was able to produce like meaningful statistics to say, these are the numbers of Ashkenazim who studied in Sephardic yeshivos. So we have some anecdotal cases, here and there. How typical it was, I'm not sure we're in a position to totally say.
Okay, so you didn't really mention his children, but Rabbi Emden being definitely the most famous, and Rabbi Emden quotes his father many times. The story about the cannonball killing his first wife and daughter comes from Rabbi Emden from Megillah Sefer, which I mentioned this the last time we did a podcast. That's, interestingly enough, your predecessor at the Jewish Center worked on the Megillah Sefer, Rabbi Dr. J.J. Shafter. So, but what can you add, though, about Rabbi Emden and his relationship with his father, the Chacham Tzvi?
So one thing to just note is that Chacham Tzvi, again, relatively speaking, because of the tragedy that happened in the first part of his life, is married late. So he's married 1688, 1689. He's already 30 plus. Which is unusual, meaning many of his contemporaries were having kids, much earlier. So he has 4 daughters, and then his first son is Yaakov Emden. So, and then Chacham Tzvi dies, at the age of 60. So, Chacham Tzvi and Yaakov Emden have almost no overlap in their adult life. By 1715. Yaakov Emden is getting married and saying goodbye to his dad. So Yaakov Emden has this extraordinary memory and is an amazing record keeper. And he idolized his father. And the first quarter, functionally, of his biography, autobiography, Megillat Sefer, is a biography of his father. And he's able to remember and record so much of what he remembered from his childhood with respect to his father that he idolized. At the same time, it's not as if these are contemporaries and the father and the son, and we have a picture of them learning together when one is 25 and one is 50, and that didn't happen. And so there's a limited kind of orbit of interaction between Chacham Tzvi and Yaakov Emden. There's not any interaction. And like I wrote to my father to ask him this, that didn't happen just because of the timing of their respective lives.
Okay, now you mentioned Alton Hamburg Wandsbeck, Ahu. This is where Rabbi Yaakov Emden lives later and spends much of his life, and the controversy with Rabbi Yosie erupts, but that's much later. At this time, as you mentioned, Chacham Tzvi is there, and then he shares the rabbinate. So how unique is that? And this is something you do go more into depth in the book. I mean, we should talk about this now. Is that what happens with the fight with Rabbi Moshe Rothenberg and Rav Ziskin? What's the nature? First of all, why is it split? Well, a split rabbinate, that's a unique kind of thing. Let's start there. Why is this split, and how unique is that the rabbinate is shared?
Yeah, so it wasn't typical, but it also wasn't totally unheard of. For instance, 17th century Amsterdam, the Sephardic community had a rotating rabbinate for a time. Again, there's a few models of this kind of divided rabbinate. It's actually a little funny because nepotism is a big problem in rabbinic hiring in the early modern period. And there's all kinds of takanos, and sometimes levad arba aratzos, and sometimes there's a more local kind of takana that says, we're not going to hire anyone from our community who's, a first-degree relative. We want to be sure that it's a fair fight and it's a meritocracy. In Altena, it happens to be, right, who are the two candidates that we're talking about? Who are the two Rabbanim we're talking about? So one is Chacham Tzvi, who is the son-in-law of the immediate past rabbi. And I should mention that toward the end of Rav Zalman Miral's Newmark life, he was declining, and Chacham Tzvi was already filling many of those communal functions in an unofficial capacity, so everyone knew him. And if that's one faction says, Chacham Tzvi should be the successor. And then there's another group who happens to be also family members, the father-in-law and another wealthy and prominent family of this fellow Moshe Rothenberg. And they say, no, he should be the rabbi. So they come up with this pshara, and they come up with this rotation, 6 months, and 6 months, again, to the contemporary ear sounds very odd and maybe even problematic. And it was problematic. Like, it didn't really work out. The arrangement held for just a couple years. And then there's this very kind of uncomfortable story where Rav Moshe Rothenberg gets into some kind of financial trouble, and he disappears for a time. They're not sure if he's coming back. And Chacham Tzvi says, I'm not sitting on a base. I'm not getting involved with this kind of person. And he says, and this was not atypical for Chacham Tzvi. It's like, it's my way or the highway. And he says, I'm out. He goes back to his cloys, and that ends that relationship.
Yeah, and that really is the end before he ends up in Amsterdam. And as you said, Amsterdam at the time is the biggest Jewish city, I think, more or less, in Europe. He's one of the, and like you said, one of the most important communities. The Sephardic, being the Spanish Portuguese, former Converso community, being the dominant community, and the Ashkenazi were gradually growing in number and strength at the time, and they hire Chacham Tzvi. And this is something also that's a matter of discussion, and you discuss this as well in the book. They give him a 3-year contract. It's interesting. You're a rabbi, so if you could talk about this, how this must be interesting for you working on this. A rabbi's contract, and we still have a copy of the contract, a 3-year contract. It's not only the rabbi had the contract, and there was a certain terms and parameters in the contract, and then there was, an option to extend the contract. Many people like this. This sounds like, sports contracts, what's going on over here. But talk about that contract and what happened with this contract, and then not really being renewed at the end. And obviously, we'll get to Chayon. Putting Chayon aside for a second, just about the contract and what's going on in Amsterdam between him and the community, the lay leaders who are so important in these communities.
Yeah. So the lay leadership is very, very powerful at this time, particularly in a community like Amsterdam, and they're holding all the cards. So the typical rabbinic contract, there's exceptions, but I would say by and large, the typical rabbinic contract in the early modern period is for a period of 3 years. And this is what they offer Chacham Tzvi, and we have the negotiation, which is, I think, a fascinating window into how rabbis are hired and how they get along with the lay leaders and what they're debating, what they're negotiating. And we have this back and forth. We're going to offer you a place to live, but Chacham Tzvi gets there and the place to live is kind of too small, so he sublets it and gets a different place to live. And how often are you going to give a drasha? And how often are you going to have a minyan in your house? How often are you going to come to the main shul? All of this is a negotiation. All of it's back and forth. Chacham Tzvi wanted a lifetime contract. The Parnasim, the lay leaders in Amsterdam, said, we're going to do 3 years. Chacham Tzvi tried to change the contract, and then there was some line in there that became a source of controversy, like, and you should just live and be well forever, something like that at the end. And that is a question mark. Is that really a siman that he's meant to have a lifetime contract, or is that just kind of a flourish and shouldn't be taken seriously with any legal force? So he gets there and he has this 3-year contract. And again, people haven't done a ton of research on rabbinic contracts, but I think I have a line in there. I say, if he's not the highest paid rabbi in the world at the time, he's certainly near the top of that hierarchy.
Yeah, I think didn't you say? I think you say in the book maybe someone should study rabbinic contracts, and this is something that someone should do a study on, write a book on. So it is very interesting. And Amsterdam has great archives, always had. So we have a lot of these materials. We have these source materials that you actually can look at and you actually can see. And so I think we should turn there. This is something, we discussed this before we started recording, which is something that you said that you struggled with the book, was how to structure it and how to go through Chacham Tzvi's life. And you ended up putting Chayon Affair as the 6th chapter. But I think based on where we are in the conversation, let's go there before we really turn to Chacham Tzvi as a posek and his importance and tshuvas in general, and the Chacham Tzvi as a posek and the Chacham Tzvi style. So let's talk about the Chayon Affair. This is, as you termed the chapter, the Chayon Affair, a battle for the soul of Amsterdam. And this involves Nechemia Chayon, Rabbi Shlomo Ayalon, who's the rabbi in the Spanish-Portuguese congregation. Professor Matt Golish has done a lot of work on him, and we discussed even this in the... he came up in the series I did on Shabtai Tzvi, also Professor Elisheva Kalbach, her book, and Moshe Chagiz, that comes up there as well. So let's turn to this and talk about the Chayon. You mentioned it briefly in passing, but what happened? Who is Nechemia Chayon? What happened? What's going on at this time? And what led to this Chayon Affair, as it's called?
So there's a lot to unpack. And it really goes back to 1665 when Shabtai Tzvi appears. The whole Jewish world is taken by Shabtai Tzvi after he apostatizes, and certainly after he dies. The overwhelming majority of Jews who had believed in the messiahship of Shabtai Tzvi revert and go back to living normal, non-messianic Jewish lives. As much as that's true, there's a group that held on to the belief that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. And they go underground. It's not appropriate for them to state any of this publicly. So academics call them, crypto Sabbatians. And they kind of, generally speaking, blend in. They're Shomer Shabbos, and they're Shomer Kashrus, and they're Shomer Mitzvos, and they daven next to you in shul, and you wouldn't be able to necessarily tell them apart from anyone else, except that in their heart of hearts, they believe that one day Shabtai Tzvi is coming back because he's Mashiach. Which, obviously, for anyone who reads the Rambam and has a general sense of what Emunah is all about, this is a big problem. We would call that a form of heresy. So there's an underground movement in favor of Shabtai Tzvi, and every once in a while someone pops up and it becomes clear that they are a Sabbatian. So Nehemiah Chayun was such a person. But what made him special is that until Nehemiah Chayun, no Sabadian had ever had the audacity, had ever had the chutzpah to publish in print actual Sabadian heresy. Sometimes there were Sabadians who published books, and there'd be a remez, and there'd be a hint, and you look, there was a coded message, but no one came out and just said, here's what we think, here's what we believe. 1712, Nehemiah Chayun published two books. One was a parish on the Chumash called Divrei Nehemiah. It's probably not any overt heresy in that sefer. And then he publishes a second sefer called Oz Le'Elokim, which is filled with kfirah. Nehemiah Chayun shows up the following year after he's published these two books. He shows up in Amsterdam. Amsterdam's a print capital. Amsterdam is a big cosmopolitan city, is a prominent Jewish community. He wants to spread his heresy. He wants to sell his books. And it just so happens that the Sephardic chief rabbi of Amsterdam at the time, as you mentioned, Shlomo Ayalon, is actually a crypto-Sabadian. And they knew each other. And Chayun knew that if he showed up in Amsterdam, he'd have a ready and willing ally, which he did. So the books come to Chacham Tzvi's attention. To make a long story short, and he sounds the alarm bell. And he says, this is not even a question. This is not even, it's not even close. This is real Sabadianism. And again, he was considered something of an expert based on his childhood and his background. So he knew exactly how to spot even a crypto-Sabadian, let alone someone who had come out of the shadows and audaciously attempted to publish Sabadian heresy. So Chacham Tzvi says, you asked my opinion, I'm just telling you what I think. And there's a whole vikuach, and it goes back and forth. And Shlomo Ayalon forms a commission. It says, in a commission of inquiry, we're going to get to the bottom of it. And it's a stacked deck. The commission decides it's actually not heresy. It's actually fine. They want Chacham Tzvi to apologize. He says, not apologizing. I stand up for what's true. And this guy is a heretic. And he and Moshe Chagiz, who's his ally and was the subject of Professor Karlbach's amazing book, The Pursuit of Heresy, Chagiz and Chacham Tzvi are basically run out of town. And they're put in kind of under house arrest, and there's some attempt to keep his position, but it fails, and he's forced to leave Amsterdam. And until those last few months of his life in Lvov, that's the last time that he holds public office.
And again, you can read about Chayun in this book and elsewhere. Something fascinating about it also, and you discuss this, is another part of rabbinic culture that's worth discussing here is haskamas. Haskamas is, at one point, haskamas were just like a copyright type of thing, and they also, it's really how they started, but then they also were like giving an approbation. Oh, this is a good person, a good book. But one issue here was he had very chashuv haskamas. Rabbi David Oppenheim and others gave him to one of the books, and you quote Rabbi Yecheskel Yeshua Feivel Tomim, who wrote a scathing. He wrote, in translation, future generations will see these books and the signatures that the great sages of Israel have given them. Perhaps, God forbid, they will rely on these books to decide what is permitted and what is prohibited. And people are relying on the books. And you say that there was one of the maskimim writes in his haskama, even though I know nothing about the beginning or the end or the space in between, I have only the words of the sages who precede me. And it's basically, why are you writing haskama? So you're giving haskama. This is a problem. We oftentimes see this today. People write haskama. Someone else wrote haskama. I write haskama. I think I looks like a nice guy. I heard he's like, okay, here's haskama. Meanwhile, someone opens the book. Oh, this chashuv Rashiva Rav wrote haskama. I can now buy the book. Meanwhile, no, not necessarily. In this case, it was a disaster. He publishes the next book. He gets haskamas from others, including Rav Tali Katz, the Smichas Chachamim, who that becomes a whole thing. And Rav Tali Katz is chayzer. And he says, oh, I didn't mean to give this bad guy haskama. Don't drag me. This guy's a rotten apple. I didn't realize. I didn't know. And that's just something also. I mean, how interesting was that to you when you were researching this?
Fascinating, right? It's a whole world. How many times do we stop to read the haskamos of the Sfarim that we learn, right? Never, right? It doesn't matter. There's there's haskama, there's 12 haskamos. Okay, I'm sure everyone said wonderful things, and I'm sure it's a wonderful sefer. Except in the case of Chayon, right, he wasn't just a heretic, he was also a forger. So he took haskamos that he'd received from one sefer and just copied and pasted them into the next sefer, even though the people who had actually written the haskamos were giving the haskamos to a totally different book. But either way, right, this was a ongoing problem, because there was just no credibility. And again, ad hayom hazeh, sometimes you have a gedolim who say, I didn't have a chance to read the book, but I don't really know the author, but I knew his father. He seemed like such a ehrlich guy. He should just be with Mazel, and the book should be such a success. And you see the big name of the gadol on the stationery. Okay, but you didn't actually read the thing where he said, I never even read one page of the book. So this was an ongoing challenge. But again, the authors had no recourse. They may not have been well known, so they want to hitch their wagon to someone who is well known because they want to sell their sefer, and they want someone to give them the copyright. Right? There's no legal recourse in 1713 in Amsterdam to say if somebody takes my book and republishes it, you'd stuck. The best you could do is have the Gadol Hadur say, I'm endorsing this book, and I hereby place a cherem on anyone who tries to republish the book without reshus for the next 5 years. Okay, so whether it's enforceable, at least it's on paper that someone supported this publication and was trying to prevent anyone from improperly using this intellectual property.
You, in page 168, you actually republished the broadside written by Chacham Tzvi against Chayon. For those interested in reading it, you can check that. A broadside is like a Pashkeville one-page paper that would be usually hung on the wall, pasted on the wall or something like that, so you can check that out. And in the book, you really go through, in this chapter, in depth, going back and forth through the arguments, what Chacham Tzvi's argument was, the end of it, as you said, the Ma'amad, especially the Sfardim, they got involved, the lay leaders that were very important. And I've discussed Amsterdam elsewhere, we've discussed the Chayon affair elsewhere, go back and listen to the Chapter Tzvi series. So I think that's enough for there. Let's turn to the part of the book that I found to be really terrific, and others who read it and told me also, is the part we really dive into the Chacham Tzvi, into the tshuvas and the Chacham Tzvi's style, and we'll go there next. You start off chapter 2 discussing tshuvas and the tshuva literature in general. I know that perhaps you want to say a few words about that, especially as it pertains to the historian who is looking at tshuvas.
Yeah. So there's so much to say about this genre, and it's wonderful because there's some very, very talented academics who are writing about these issues now. Sometimes opening up issues for the first time, even though we've been reading Shilos and Shuvos, for 1,000 years. So maybe I'll just say one kind of 30,000-foot point about Shuvos that I think is important, particularly for Talmidim in the Beis Medrash. And the point is this: we open up Shilos and Shuvos, and the working assumption is, okay, here's the Shaila, here's the Tshuva. There's a person who wrote the question, and there's the person who wrote the answer, and that's the story. And it's true, sometimes that is the story. It's a closed universe. There's two people involved. And sometimes that's like 3% of the story, and there's 20 people involved. And this is a letter that was sent to 5 Rabbanim to seek an answer. Or this was a letter that was sent to one particular posek, and the posek forwarded it. Like, let me see what somebody else thinks. I suspect X, Y, and Z, but let me ask someone who's a little more senior and a little more scholarly than I am. And he sends it to the next person. And the next person says, I basically agree with you, but I want to forward it one more time. Or the next person says, I actually strongly disagree. He writes back to the original posek, and now the posek's like, oh boy, now it's me, and somebody disagrees with me. Let me involve a third party, and he'll be mafkriya, and we'll form a coalition, or we'll get a rove. And so there's a whole universe sometimes lurking beneath the surface of what looks like, oh, there's just, here's a page, a shaila and a tshuva. And again, sometimes that's all it is. But it's worth wondering if actually that's all it is. And in so many cases, for Chacham Tzvi, it wasn't like 1 out of 170 tshuvos, this was the case. So many of these cases, so many of these, shailos and tshuvos, which again, it's just a page in the Sefer, but it's actually just one component of a much broader, much richer story.
A very important part of Shailos and Tshuvos is that it's not a Bezdin. And then this comes up also with Batei Dinin, is that, how does which Bezdin is the one that has jurisdiction? But this happens very often with tshuvas, and this is something discussed as well in the book, and perhaps you want to talk about the tshuva and the tshuvas that relate to this, which is, you go ask one Rav, you ask another Rav, which Rav, or then another one, which one do you go with? And which one has jurisdiction? Which one has the ability to say, you know what? This is the psak. This is what you do in this instance. And very often these relate to divorce, questions of aguna. These are important. This is very often the case in Shailos Tshuvos, those are familiar with the literature, and certainly here is no different.
Yeah, there was a case that Chacham Tzvi was dealing with about a particular couple that got married, and there was a question of whether or not they should have gotten married. The woman was from Hamburg. The husband was from Prague, and there were two different poskim involved, and they had very different thoughts about the case. And Rabbi Avram Broda said, "I have jurisdiction. The Fasan's from Prague. I'm the rabbi of Prague, so I paskin. It's the end of the case." And Chacham Tzvi says, the real shaila here is about the kala, and the kala is from my community, so I have jurisdiction over the case, right? And how do you settle this? And sometimes there's no obvious answer. Maybe the shailos and tshuvos are unsettled, and so somebody needs to create a beis din and write a formal psak. And sometimes somebody will say, we need to get a coalition going here. If we can have every important shtat rav in the whole region agree to sign on this psak, well, that'll get everyone's attention. There's 12 rabbanim who signed on to this psak. That has to be worth more than if there's just one. Right? So there's an unresolved and open question, not just in the early modern period, but really even beyond the early modern period. Who has the final word when it comes to psak? And that is a question that gets opened up over and over again.
And this is actually a fascinating case and something that you discuss in depth, because Rav Ram Broda, first of all, is one of the most important figures that's not well known, that's like completely unknown today, even though he wrote Svarim. And so Rav Ram Broda is staunchly opposed, and Chacham Tzvi assembles a real coalition. Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, Yezeb Eliyahu Shapiro, the Eliyah Rabbah, and many others, for many others join his team, so to speak, and Rav Broda is not backing down, and it comes to the point where he threatens cherem. He's going to put a cherem here. At that point, the Chacham Tzvi has to threaten. He threatens him. If you put a cherem, he threatened them, that the Rav Broda is going to be, basically violating halacha, and it becomes a mess before he get everyone to back down. So really, and you see this at other times as well. Cleves comes to mind, where Rabbanim just dig in. Their positions are really dug in, and it becomes apparently, seemingly personal. It becomes a really, not personal in the sense of like the halacha. This is the halacha, and it becomes they really stake out their sides, and get Rabbanim to join each team. And this is something you discussed. Really, they create these teams where, I have the greater amount of Rabbanim, I win versus you. It's like, and sometimes the other side doesn't back down, and this happens.
Yeah, this happens. I would say again, not infrequently. And look, this it was an opening gambit. I identify a few cases because I'm writing about Chacham Tzvi. There are many more cases, and I think it would be fascinating material for someone to investigate and explore on a kind of more holistic level throughout the period.
Yeah, you have really a number of fascinating cases. First of all, you have one that has the great portrait of Rabbi Aaron Phoebus Hart, Aaron Uri Phoebus Hart, the chief rabbi of England, in the 18th century. So he's one. There's a question with him. There's another one that involves the mischievous suitor of Casali Monferrato in Italy. Quite an interesting one as well. I don't know if you want to talk about either of those. If there's some others in this chapter as well. I don't know if you want to talk about either of those chuvas and what happens there.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a word about the Casale case. There was a case of Safek Kiddushin, and there was just this extraordinarily protracted machlokes between the local rabbanim. It was two kind of junior rabbanim who were on one side, and the more senior, Rav of the city was on the other side. And they couldn't resolve the case. And each of them started like a campaign. And they wrote letters, dozens and dozens and dozens of letters. Let me tell you about the case, and can you? And so these letters start flowing in. How can we resolve this case of Safek Kiddushin? Does this woman actually need a get? And it was just stunning to see the breadth, this collection of chuvos, that one little case from a tiny little community in an Italian-speaking city of Casale, how much controversy and how many chuvos it generated was just stunning.
Let's move on and to some of the most fascinating parts of the book, which is the Chacham Tzvi and his relationship with Kabbalah, the Chacham Tzvi's relationship with Mishnah, and the Chacham Tzvi's relationship with Minhag. These are quite fascinating and, again, highly recommended reading for listeners. So let's start with Kabbalah. As you term it, too much information, the mystic who waged war on mystical texts. Let's start there.
Okay, so just a kind of word of background. And this is also something that scholars just in the last 10, 20, 30 years have been writing about. And that's sort of two concurrent trends in the early modern period. One is Mishnah as an independent subject is on the ascendancy. And again, it's not to say people weren't studying Mishnah. Of course they were studying Mishnah, but they were studying it in the context of Gemara. And you could name on one hand, probably less than one hand, the number of Perushim on the Mishnah before the 15th, 16th century. You get to the early modern period, and now they have Mishnayos study groups, and there'll be a chevra Mishnah, and people are writing Perushim on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah as an independent text is being published over and over again. There's a pocket-sized Mishnah that people can take when they travel. So Mishnah is on the ascendancy. At the same time, Kabbalah is on the ascendancy, and there's a lot to talk about within the context of Sabbateanism and Shabtai Tzvi, and there's a kind of standing debate whether or not Kabbalah was responsible for helping Sabbateanism spread, or whether it was Shabtai Tzvi who helped Kabbalah spread, and they might both be true. But particularly in the aftermath of the Sabbatean debacle, the rabbinic establishment really felt that Kabbalah was dangerous. If you're not initiated, if you don't have the training, if you don't have the teacher, and you're just opening a Zohar, so that could be dangerous. And so what I argue in one of the chapters of this book is that Chacham Tzvi, and I think it's fascinating to notice this, was very beholden to the Mishnah. And sometimes it's like, well, why don't you just quote the Torah? Why don't you just quote the Shulchan Aruch? And he quotes the Mishnah. And it's like, what? Like, we know there's a Mishnah, but well, we're a little past that. We know there's a Mishnah, and there's a debate, and the Gemara, and the Rishonim, and there's a Psak in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. Like, shouldn't we start there? So fascinating just to notice in his Derech HaPsak that the Mishnah figures so prominently in so many cases. And what I tried to argue is that the Mishnah is a kind of counterweight to the ascendancy of Kabbalah, because Chacham Tzvi, even though he is a practitioner of and quite an expert in Kabbalah personally, he quotes it very, very sparingly. he has some explicit moments when he says, I really want people to be careful about how much they study Kabbalah and how much they risk abusing Kabbalah. And so there's this attempt to create a source of authority, which is, assuming that Kabbalah is equally ancient. So I'm going to take you back. You want an ancient source, says Chacham, I'm going to take you back to the Mishnah, and let's just start there. Again, he's not paskening the Mishnah against the Shulchan Aruch, but he wants you to know that the sources are very ancient. They go all the way back to the Mishnah, and the traditional sources should take precedence over the mystical sources.
And you really lay this out in the book much more than here. You really show the examples. You really show it. It'd be too long to sit and lay it out. But you really, lay this out. And again, those of you interested should read chapter 3. And also, you make the point how Mishnah was on the rise. Rabbi is his father. He published his father. Rabbi Yaakov is Leket, and he talks about it. And he says that in Leket HaKemach, Rabbi is his own sefer. He says it is appropriate for a person to prioritize the study of Mishnah over Pilpul. For after a young person begins with the knowledge of the Mishnah, the door will be wide open for him subsequently for whatever he desires. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, also you point out, had a Mishnah study group in his home in Altona, and the first book he published was Lechem Shemayim, his commentary on the Mishnah, 1733. So there, you see the connections there between those in the Chacham Tzvi's orbit and those in his world and their connection to Mishnah, and you see that interest. Another thing that, and again, you talk about this is the Sabbatian issue in Europe with Kabbalah and how he was opposed to it, not opposed to Kabbalah per se, but usually it was Makubal, but opposed to kind of the spread of Kabbalah. This is something that, we see with his son Rabbi Yaakov Emden with Pachas Farim taking the next step further.
Yes, the working assumption is, Sabbatianism is a direct result of the abuse of Kabbalah, and it's dangerous. Look what happens. We just saw it, right? This just happened in lived memory. There was a whole Sabbatian movement, and Kabbalah was some form responsible for this, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and this is something that he, as you said, he complained about those that use desire and use it according to them. And he says, one quote, "I would not have needed to commit this sentiment to writing, but for the purpose of dissuading those who fancy themselves wise enough to rule against the poskim on the basis of desire." And this is something that comes up throughout his Shuvas, such comments. And again, you have his son, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, writing with Pachas Farim later on, next generation, he writes that. A fascinating part of Chacham Tzvi is Chacham Tzvi and Minhag. And maybe this is something that has to do with perhaps his Sephardic upbringing, his going to Sephardi yeshivas, Sfarad versus Ashkenaz. And Ashkenaz, those that are familiar, you have a whole corpus of Minhag Sfarim. You can even find these still today, republished by Mechon Yerushalayim, Minhagei Maril, and you have Minhagei Rabbi Isaac Tirna and others. This is very important. Ashkenazim, Minhag Yisrael Torah, we have this adage, but the Ashkenazim Minhag is very, very, very important. Sfarad, Spain, those of Spanish descent, Sfarad, a little different. And maybe this is where Chacham Tzvi kind of takes that in-between view. And I'll let you talk about this in general and where you see this in the Chacham Tzvi and the Chacham Tzvi's attitude towards Minhag and his willingness to buck the trend of the Minhag at times.
Yeah, you said it. You said it great. The Ashkenazim place enormous weight on Minhag, right? And 20th century scholars have written a lot about this. The sense that, if our fathers and grandfathers were from, and this is the way they did it, then this must be right, and this is the way we should do it. And Minhag's very, very important. And so you have these lines, in the Maharik and in the Ramah, like you can't change a Minhag, like even if it's not Shayach, and you can't change the Minhag. And even in sort of micro issues like, the Nusach HaTzvila or the Matbeya, like where you think there would be a little flexibility because there's so much, so many different nuschos. No, like this is the way the shul did it. This is the way the community did it. It has to be preserved. Masha Ein Kain, the Sfardim, who they're not telling you not to look at the minhag, but they're much more willing to say, if there's a problem with the minhag, it was maybe a minhag taus that didn't ever get the imprimatur of the rabbinic establishment. It was just kind of from the Hamona. So maybe we could dispense with that minhag. So I tried to argue that Chacham Tzvi, and maybe because of his vast exposure and training to the Sephardic world, was much more willing to abrogate minhagim, and I tried to demonstrate this by comparing him to some of his contemporaries. So sometimes he was successful, and sometimes he was unsuccessful. His son Yaakov Emden quotes his father famously as saying, "If I had the ability, I would do away with kidneys, because it's yatzas chara behefsedo, and it's just you shouldn't do it anymore. You're creating more chametz than you are matzah." And it obviously, for whatever attempts he made, so we're still no way to not eat kidneys here in 2025. But in some cases, he actually was more successful, and sometimes there was a minhag which he just said, "We're not doing that anymore," because it never should have been a minhag in the first place.
Yeah, this is something that you quote Rabbi Elbog in Kesef Cheskel, same time period, says in his will, in all my days, he never altered any minhag, and the Magen Avraham is very trying to uphold minhagim. This is what goes on in Ashkenaz, but the Chacham Tzvi, and as you argue and you give examples, he was trying at times to, like you mentioned the kidneys example, and others really trying to go against that. This is not always go against it, but you see him kind of more willing again to buck the trend. This is something also again a very persuasive, very good argument in the chapter, well worth reading. Something else that you discuss is the rabbinate under siege, and this is something that happens at the time, and this is the generation before the rise of Haskalah and Maskilim, and emancipation, when the lady's really gonna grow. So right now it's slow, but first of all, it's just worth reading the beginning. We quote from Megillah Sefer, what happened to Chacham Tzvi, like others, but the most creative one that it's just an insult. It's not only what we're referring to, but as an insult, certain Aaron Palak Gokes, he had a controversy over rival cantors, and he took issue at the Chacham Tzvi, and therefore he named his dog Chacham Tzvi. This is really, wow, he was trying to get back at the rabbi. But what do you mean by this, the rabbinate under siege, and what was going on at the time, and how did the Chacham Tzvi, and other rabbanim, but we're focused on Chacham Tzvi, how did they deal with this?
So this is a big topic, the assault on authority and the assault on rabbinic authority. And it's coming from a bunch of different places, right? So one place it's coming from is sectarians. You have people who say, we're not continuing the ways of the establishment. Sabbatianism was maybe just the most prominent example, but sectarians writ large say, we're not beholden to rabbinic authority. Then you have lay leaders who say, it's not your authority, it's my authority. So in some communities, if the rabbi wanted to publish a sefer, anybody wants to publish a sefer, the mamad said, you have to get rishus from us first. And it wouldn't be the Rav of the community who had that authority. There's always debate, like, who gets to pronounce a cherem? Do the lay leaders need to get permission from the Rav to pronounce a cherem? The Rav needs to get permission, or each one can function independently, right? Who has the final say? And then there's another piece, which is this sort of unqualified or underqualified rabbanim, who are rabbinic functionaries, who want to take a kind of bigger piece of the pie. So there's always a debate, but the more established rabbis are always bemoaning the fact that anybody with the title rabbi thinks that they're a big authority, and they take on so much authority in their lives, and we object. So from a bunch of different precincts, you have these challenges. This is really kind of just getting to, as you said, pre-Haskalah, the last generations of the Kehillah, where the fracture hasn't happened yet. And the rabbi sort of expects that if he's making a pronouncement, he's issuing a psak, like, it should be observed, it should be respected. And to the extent that that doesn't happen, it starts to upset the apple cart, and a lot of these controversies get generated because there's just less clarity around whose jurisdiction and whose authority we're actually under.
Really interesting stuff. More to talk about with that. Something that I've discussed elsewhere a bunch of other times, but we can't not mention it, is the Chacham Tzvi's famous tshuva with Chacham David Nieto in London on being accused of being Spinozist. So if you want to just briefly mention that tshuva, that controversy.
Yeah, so that's actually a great example where, if you just pick up Chacham Tzvi, so there's one page, and here's the shaila, and here's the tshuva. There's a particular rabbi, I don't even know if he's named in the tshuva, who's accused of being a heretic, and I didn't really even understand the question because he's certainly not a heretic, and it's totally fine. You start to unpack it, and you realize there was a whole story here that was going on for a number of years. Chacham David Nieto, who was perfectly pious and honorable and traditional and learned, a rabbi functioning as the Sephardic Chacham in London, was accused by some of his members of being a deist. And it seems to be that this was probably just a pretext for some kind of larger polemic, maybe Sabbatean underground forces that were trying to overthrow the more traditional anti-Sabbatean Chacham. And Chacham Tzvi came to the defense of David Nieto and said, not at all, this man is not a deist, nothing he said has anything to do with deism. And there was some question of using the word teva as a proxy in one of his sermons, and Chacham Tzvi, in a very learned fashion, says this term is used in all kinds of contexts, and he quotes much earlier sources, including from Sephardic Rishonim, where he says this is all perfectly within the tradition, and there's nothing to worry about. He exonerates David Nieto, and the two develop a friendship, and that comes back together when Chacham Tzvi is reunited briefly with the London community after he's expelled from Amsterdam in 1714.
There are so many famous and important tshuvas in Chacham Tzvi. It's not that big of a book. It's like you said. He wrote this other book, which I'll link to the other one on Hebrew Books, by the way, for the listeners. Check out the show's notes. But these are like his. Basically, it's his only book, and it's so important and so impactful. And this is something you explore in the last chapter, Afterlife, the response of modern-day poskim to Chacham Tzvi's early modern response. And you pick three tshuvas. One, which I can't believe we didn't mention it until, almost an hour into the podcast, the chicken without a heart. I mean, this is something that I've discussed at length on the podcast elsewhere, but I had Maus Kahana, his book, is Tarnagolet B'li Lev, is about this, that's the main part of that. But we do have to discuss that, something you go in depth. The Golem one, which we discussed, we mentioned that already. And then there's the 2-day Yom Tov. The other thing in being in Eretz Yisrael, Chacham Tzvi is really the, why people keep 1 day versus 2 days. But it's to be specific. Obviously, if you live in Eretz Yisrael, no question. But so you kind of trace these. You did something very interesting where you trace these tshuvas, how they were received throughout the generations until today, and how they're still important today. And if you want to just briefly recap, because I think that's also another fascinating chapter.
Sure. So there's many more books to be written about Chacham Tzvi, but one of them is the reception history of Chacham Tzvi, which was not this book, right? Which is to say, the Tshuvos are published in 1712, and then what happens to them? How do they get received? Do other poskim give a lot of credence to the Piskei Halacha in Chacham Tzvi? Do they kind of cite him, ignore him? Right? Not everyone gets received in the same way. You pick up the Aruch HaShulchan, you pick up the Mishnah Berurah. Who are they quoting? How often do they cite this person? Every time do they cite him? Do they paskin like him? Sniff lahak? How much weight is assigned to a particular posek? And that's its own scholarship, and that's its own investigation. Again, invite the next interested scholar to do that work. As a kind of sample, I chose three of what I think are among the most prominent or most important tshuvos in the Sefer, and just looked briefly at how they have been received since the time that they were published. So the heartless chicken obviously has massive implications for questions of cardiac death versus brain death. Where does life end? And that's been a major controversy ad hayom hazeh. And really, the beginning of that conversation is Shut Chacham Tzvi. Then there's the question, as you said, of the golem, which, who would have guessed? And this is also worth mentioning. Not every page of a Shilas and Shuvos is a lived case, right? These tend to be case studies. Somebody says, this happened, what do we do? And sometimes Chacham Tzvi says, I was wondering about the following issue. So Shilas and Shuvos are the preferred genre of exposition in the early modern period, much more than other kinds of rabbinic works. So he's writing, this is his sefer, and he's not writing a parish on Tanakh. He's not writing a parish on the Shulchan Aruch. He's not writing a parish on the Gemara. This is his sefer, and so included in his sefer sometimes is, let me tell you what I think pshat is in Tosfos, or let me tell you what I think should be the halacha if somebody were to create a golem, could they be counted in a minyan? So what seemed like a kind of a hypothetical in 1712 has massive implications for questions of artificial intelligence and robotics and all kinds of issues that we might be thinking about in the 21st century, and issues that presumably were not on the mind of Chacham Tzvi when he wrote this tshuva. And then the question of the second day of Yantif in Eretz Yisrael for visitors to Israel from Chutz La'aretz. So this was really a fascinating progression, because when Chacham Tzvi wrote the tshuva, it was a total outlier, meaning people were visiting Eretz Yisrael all the time. And no one was keeping one day of Yantif. We have the evidence. Here's what people did when they visited. So to say, not just like conceptually, this is what I think, but functionally to basically be accusing everyone of being wrong, everyone in the past and everyone in the present, says this is like they're getting it wrong. They should only be keeping one day. At the time in the 18th century, that was a total outlier position. But by the time you get to the 19th century and the 20th century, there start to be poskim who pick up Chacham Tzvi's tshuva and say there's actually room to think about, entertain, and maybe even implement this position as a lived psak. And now in the 21st century, again, I didn't see anybody do a 21st century statistical analysis, but there's lots and lots of visitors to Eretz Yisrael who are now somech on Shuvas Chacham Tzvi. And there are many poskim, even if they're not telling you to poskim like Chacham Tzvi, will use the tshuva of Chacham Tzvi as a snif lahakel, depending on the whatever shasat chak or whatever b'diavad situation might arise. So a tshuva that again seemed like a total outlier 300 years ago suddenly has a chiyus and is now kind of alive and well.
So also, for those that don't know, just the chicken without a heart, the basic of the tshuva itself was that there's a chicken, it had no heart, is it kosher or not, and there was a girl, the mother was cleaning it, the girl was there, the cat was around, and the Chacham Tzvi was matir and Rebbeinu Eibeshitz said no, when the Jesuits were involved, the university, this was a whole thing, and Reuven Margolis has this famous theory that he wrote, that this is why Yaakov Emden and Rebbeinu Eibeshitz fight erupted. Can't even listen. He says it, so I'm just saying it. It doesn't really make a lot of sense at all, but that's what he says. But just to know that this was one of the, that's what happened. That was the tshuva on that, and then there's the golem one that he wanted to know about his grandfather, and then the grandfather made the golem, and then there's the one in Yom Tov. So this not only reception history, it also shows the impact. And the Chacham Tzvi is his legacy. I mean, obviously, legacy Chacham Tzvi is one of the Gedolei Olam, but you see his impact still today, of course. But this is how you can actually trace it and actually see it, almost statistically. Anyway, of course, anyone knows Chacham Tzvi. Also, with that, I will link to the book in the show's notes. I will say the cover of the book has a painting of the Chacham Tzvi, so it is the actual picture of the Chacham Tzvi. Many Gedolim from this time period, we don't have their portrait, although those that are in Amsterdam and London, there are painters there. This is actually, we do have. It's those really in Eastern Europe we don't necessarily have. So you can actually, you can see the Chacham Tzvi. We have the picture of the Chacham Tzvi on the cover. Also, the book hardcover is like $45, right? Not too bad for an academic book. As sometimes there was a deal on Amazon at one point. Sometimes there are, deals can happen. So stay tuned. I'll link the book in the show's notes. And again, I highly recommend it. I don't say that for all the books. I think not only highly recommended, I think it's very interesting. I think many listeners will find it of interest, whether academically or also just your average layman. You're familiar with the Chacham Tzvi enough. There's like really what we've discussed here, biographical information, historical information, Torah in there. There's a lot of interesting information the way it's done. And I'll just ask you this also, that you're a rabbi doctor, as I mentioned. You're a rabbi and you're also a doctor now, but you're not a professor in the general sense where you work in university. So you wrote a biography. Biography is something that's kind of fell out of vogue a little bit now, and it's not as common anymore. It's kind of classic academic biographies. I don't know if you know why that is or what your feeling is, or at least I can ask you as it pertains to you personally, why did you decide to write a biography?
Yeah, so I happen to be a traditionalist, and I happen to think that biographies are very, very powerful. Rav Kook, actually, in eulogizing his father-in-law, the Aderet, has a beautiful line, or really a couple of paragraphs, where he says, if you learn about and you think about and you read about the lives of these extraordinary people, and he has the Aderet in mind, but Gedolim kind of more generally, if you learn about these people, they're with you and they elevate you because of your proximity to them. And so there's something very special about being able to just spend time with these Gedolim. And my hope was that this would be a kind of window not just onto the life of Chacham Tzvi, but it's the keyhole through which you can really see the whole rabbinic structure of the early modern period. And at the end of the day, these are the Gedolim who are shaping what it means to live the way we live. These are the Gedolim who influence the Piskei Halacha that shape our daily lives. And so to understand what makes them tick, and to understand their controversies, and to understand their decision-making, to me, that was something that I always found not just attractive, but almost like magnetic. Like, how could you not be drawn to these kinds of questions?
Okay, so hopefully the listeners will find the same, and they can and should read the book, so they can check that out with a link in the show's notes. And I want to thank again Gluck Plumbing for sponsoring this episode, and thank you, Rabbi Levine, for joining me once again to discuss the Chacham Tzvi.
Such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Nachi.